Hi and welcome to Magic Numbers. This is episode number 114, and today I'm going to be answering the questions from the people. Which people? Well, a bunch of them are my patrons, so if you feel like, join the Patreon. There should be a description to it somewhere on my Twitch description, and if you're watching it on YouTube or listening as a podcast, well, then definitely should be a link to it. But also questions from people who follow me on Twitter. We have a nice collection of the questions from nice collection of my followers, and I'm going to try to answer them. Before we move into that, obviously, thanks for the sponsorship from the mtgazone.com, and thanks for the support from my patrons. And thank you, my cat, for making side noises. You know that there's going to be a slide about you as well. Talking about my patrons, I have 3 new patrons to report, which is great. We have Josh, we have Maxim, and we have Simon. Thank you all for supporting my creativity and my data analysis, and for sweetening the deal of churning through Excel sheets for hours and hours to try to find some answers. Thank you very much for all of that. Okay. Before we move to the main topic, which is many topics, a small preamble. There is a lifetime of data analysis in Limited, and I'm doing quite a lot of it, and I only am touching the tip of the iceberg that is sticking out as an easy pickable low-hanging fruit. There is so much angles that you can look at the data, and looking through the questions that people ask me, I realize just how many things I just don't talk enough about because there's just not enough time and there's not enough episodes I can squeeze them into, despite probably being one of the longer format content creators, because my average podcast is 1.5, 2 hours, which is unpalatable for most, and I still don't care. I just do my 2 hours episodes and I'm happy with it. But even with that amount of analysis I do, it's still not possible to touch everything. And there are some analysis I'm not even going to touch because it would take me weeks to do it. And it would be very interesting, but not 7 hours sitting at the computer waiting for it to calculate something interesting. So I would highly encourage everyone to do more data analysis. I don't want to be the only one. And I'm not. There are a couple of people that do that as well, but there could be much more done. And even if some drafts of analysis will be made by other people, it would be great and it would enrich, because the trap is that if one person does too much, they can be blindsided by some analysis, not see some possibilities, or let their personal biases get in the way of a good analysis. And I'm not immune to biases. No one is. But okay. Let's move to the question of the week segment, which this week is the whole episode, so might be a bit more developed than normally. And I sort of randomly assorted those questions. They are not going to be themed, because I thought mixing a bit of more relaxed content with a bit of more analysis, with a bit of general, with a bit of MKM, is going to be more interesting than just chunking them into blocks. And also that way you will not be able to know which time to switch off, because maybe the most interesting question is still coming up. So question number 1 from Hugman is, what has been your most surprising finding? And there were many things that surprised me when I was doing the analysis, but I think that the most amazing thing that I found in terms of how surprising I found the result was the distribution of the speed of the format. So here I have this graph, and it shows what percentage of games are ending on a particular turn. I think, if I remember correctly, this analysis specifically is from Phyrexia LB1, but the graph looks pretty similar in every single format. And what surprised me is the distribution of it, because it looks pretty nice in terms of having one strong peak where the games end, that happens around turn 7, 8, or 9, depending on the format. And then it slowly drops off towards the longer games. So there are very few games that last over 12 turns. But you have this long kind of tail of game durations. And it was amazing because I was expecting, because you have 10 archetypes, maybe even 20, because there are 3 color decks, that it would be more chaotic, that we will see, maybe 20% games end at turn 7, then there's a dip, and then there is like 15% of the games ending on turn 10 because the slower decks are having much longer games. It's not the case, and it has not been the case in any format I analyzed this before. So it looks pretty stunning if you see the graph, if you're watching it. If you're not, well, obviously you can get access to the slides if you are a patron, so consider doing that. Then you can watch it while you're listening, especially when there are those kind of graphs that do require to cast an eye. And yeah, that was my most surprising finding. Couple of other surprising findings. I think that the differences in ALSA in Pack 1 and Pack 3 between signpost uncommons and fixing was an interesting finding that I found quite surprising. And by that I mean that the fixing cards go much later in early packs, and then they are picked earlier in the late packs. And signpost uncommons have the reverse, when they go quite late in pack 3, but they are picked early in pack 1 because people are looking for their identity in the draft. I sort of could have maybe, hypothesized that is the case, but how universal that rule is across many formats was always quite surprising. And also, one thing that was pretty surprising is how consistently things are wheeling based on their ALSA, which means that all the cards, independently of how powerful they are, their ALSA behaves in a similar way, which is a nice thing to know. When the card has ALSA of 5, the distribution of where it's being picked is very similar to the cards that have ALSA of 8, for example. And again, all of those things are surprising about how consistent they are, because you would expect Magic, so many unique people, so many individualistic characters, you would expect that it might be very preference driven, but actually when you look at it and as a huge population, it starts behaving like any population would, which is nice because it gives more predictive power to data analysis mainly. Okay, question number 2. How much can you infer about non-17 lands users from your data? Have you ever been able to compare/contrast your information to untapped.gg? It's from Contrapass Man. So there are several metrics that are giving us some information about other users, and these are the ones that are not using 17 lands. ALSA is the most important one because ALSA looks at how cards behave in a pack, which means that it looks at the behavior of the players that are not necessarily 17 lands users. And from ALSA, you can read the metagame of the draft in general and not only what the top players are doing. This is important because by that you can sort of position yourself in that metagame. If you know that certain cards are underdrafted, it means that they're underdrafted by all players, not only by 17 lands users. If some cards are overdrafted, same thing. So I would highly recommend looking at ALSA when you try to position yourself in the metagame, when you want to find which archetypes are more open than the others. For example, if you would analyze the MKM draft data, you will for sure see that Simic decks are slightly more open than Boros deck right now, even though Boros decks were much more open in the first weeks. And based on that, you probably shouldn't be too optimistic in getting into a Boros deck nowadays. It doesn't mean that you shouldn't draft it, because if it's open, it's really powerful. But you have to know that there is going to be a high fail rate linked to drafting Boros right now, while Simic is quite consistently open. So you can, if you know how to draft Simic decks or those green kind of soupy multicolor decks, or maybe green-black, you're much more likely to be successful. So for example, as an actionable advice, when I'm drafting and I have a choice between equal power green and white card, I will pick the green card and give myself a chance. If I see a much better white card, I'm going to pick a white card and see what happens. But I know that this pick is laden with some insecurity of whether this card is going to make my deck or not. But partially, if you manage to pivot into green, you can play anything. So if the white card is a very powerful rare, then obviously there will always be a spot for it. But this is not the only thing that you can actually use to gauge what other players are doing. When you have your game data or draft data, especially in the game data, you can infer some information about the opponents of the 17 lands users from that data. So for example, when I look at the win rate on the play, I can test the win rate on the play only for 17 land users, or I can do it for both the 17 land user and the opponent, or I can just do it for the opponent. And in roughly, well, in more than 95% of the games, the opponents are not 17 lands users. And through that, you can get a better impression if there is a difference between 17 lands users and general population in the aspect of having, for example, on the play advantage, or how long does a game last when you win. You can get a decent information. Mind you that this comes with some caveats, because some groups are better covered by the 17 lands users data than others. So for example, we will have less information about those drafters who are occasional bronze, silver level drafters, because there is not that much game coverage for bronze and silver in 17 lands compared to what I expect is the population of those groups. Also, because if we're talking about people that play draft not as frequently, bronze will have many more players participating. So even if you have a large chunk of games, you will miss some of that data because you will only analyze the ones that were, lucky/unlucky enough to play against a 17 lands user. So you're going to miss more users. While Mythic, Diamond, it's a smaller group of players that play a lot of games. So you're going to cover this group much better, because if someone plays 100 games, just by chance, they will be matched up against someone that uses 17 lands from time to time. But if you have, thousands of users that play only 5-6 games, you will miss most of those players and you will never see any kind of glimpse of their data. So hopefully that answers. I never looked at any data from untapped.gg, mainly because I don't know if that data is freely available. 99% of the time I use only what is publicly available in 17 lands, because we decided that it would be unfair if I had access to additional data. So I only occasionally get some access to the data that people are not getting in the public data sets. And it's mainly not for my personal use to release it as a podcast, but mainly for things like testing if 17 lens is working correctly or something like that. Okay, question 3, and it's a double because the questions are very similar in their nature, or at least linked with the theme. First one is, how has format play decay changed over time? Are certain aspects of format potentially driving folks, at least 17 lens users? Very good caveat added to the question. I highly applaud adding that. To hang around longer, deeper into a format's release. And that's the question from Wet Gruel, which, as far as I know, it's just Timor, isn't it? And the other question is there a way to measure how long-lasting a format is? For example, which formats can be played many times without getting old? And what might make them so? For example, color balance, speed of the format, Prince, Pauper. And the question is from Tonberry, or Toneberry. So I looked at the decay rate of different formats. And on this graph, you will see percent of games that were played week 2 or later. So basically, it also shows you what percentage of all the games were played in week 1. You just need to deduct this number from 100%. And we see that it doesn't differ that much. There is no time trend that is significant. I think that, maybe a couple of the older formats only played 20% of their games in week 1, like Brothers War, Dominaria United, and Kamigawa Neon Dynasty. A bunch of them were between 74 and 78% of the games were played after week 1. So, between 22 and 27% of the games were played in week 1. The one that had most of the games played in week 1 was 1. Roughly 27% of all the games in the format were played in the week 1. And this shows that this format was significantly higher decay. So people played week 1, they didn't find the format interesting and they stopped playing. The other one was LCI, when around 26% of the games were played in week 1. MKM is similar, but I wouldn't draw any conclusions from MKM because the format is still not finished, so there will still be some games that will be added to the pool of the games. But for most of it, formats like WoW, LTR, March of the Machine, roughly 23% of the games were played in week 1, and then 77-ish, 78% of the games were played in weeks 2 to the end of the format. And then I looked at the same thing, but with week. Obviously, the axis I didn't change because I would I bother with such trivialities. This is week 5 or later. So what percentage of the games was played after week 4 of the format? And here we have some differences because only 18% of the games were played after week 5, after week 4. And in Kamigawa Neon Dynasty, which is the other side of the spectrum, 40% of the games were played after week 5. So there was quite a large chunk of games played later. This also means that this format was played at high intensity pretty late into the set. And Kamigawa Neon Dynasty was probably one of the most long-lasting sets in the recent years because it was a good game. Strategies changed throughout it. You could play aggro, you could play control, you could play 5-color soup. It was quite interesting as a format. And because of that, I think it had higher longevity. Plus, the Kamigawa is an appealing format for players because of the flavor, lore, and I think that it was a resounding success on all fronts last time. Plus, it had also busted cards for playing in Constructed. I'm looking at you, Fable of the Mirror Breaker. And other sets, roughly quarter of the games was played in that period, so not much diversity there. One set that was played quite a lot in the later stages of the format, apart from Neon Dynasty, is also Brothers War, and also pretty interesting format with plenty of riddles to be discovered. It was not my favorite personally, but I do appreciate how interesting the drafts could have been in that particular format, especially with additional slot in the pack with artifacts that added extra complexity to it. Okay, and yeah, MKM, only 1/6 of the games were played after week 4, but keep in mind that this format is still far from being finished, so there will be some games played in the dying stages of the format, which I think will make it comfortably into this 25% area after we're done with it. Question number 4. What do you think about opening hand win rate as a metric for card power? In another group, there are some loud voice claiming that this is a better metric. I personally agree that game in hand is the best objective metric, as it considers cases when the card is drawn late, while open hand seems just to focus on aggressive cards. Do you have any opinion on those opening hand win rate claims? Thriving Magpies. And I do like the pun. Thieving Magpie was in my standard decks at the time when Thieving Magpie was first in standard. So I do have sentiment for that card, but Thriving Magpie, much better name. So what I did here is I basically plotted against each other game in hand win rate and opening hand win rate. And you can see a straight line with some diversity within it, but actually a pretty good correlation between those two metrics. So I don't think that there is an argument to be made that one metric is much better than the other. You can get information from all of it, and I think that focusing on which metric is better is missing a point a bit. I think if you want to understand the format, you should look at both of the metrics and draw conclusions based on both. Looking at the open game in hand win rate, mainly because it has a higher sample size, so it will give you a more precise measurement. We're going to go into just how precise quite soon. But also because, you want to know more about cards that are good also late in the game. But you want to maybe evaluate. You want to look at the cards with the high delta between opening hand win rate and game game's drawn win rate and look at those cards as early cards, late cards, and then maybe try to figure out what is the place for cards that have low opening hand win rate but high win rate when drawn, and vice versa. Look at the cards that are super good when they are in your opening hand but not so good when you draw them later. And by the way, if you're wondering what is this outlier, the card that has 73% opening hand win rate, but only 63% win rate when it's drawn later in the game. Any guesses in the chat what card could it be in this format? This is a huge difference. Like everything else is sort of like linearly connected, and maybe, you know, there is 5 percentage point difference between opening hand and game in hand win rate, but this one has a whooping 10 percentage point difference. So if anyone has an idea, I'm taking guesses right now while I'm drinking my tea. No peeking also. I'm going to trim it in the YouTube version. Hey, Slag Zero. No, it's not Novice Inspector. It's even better than that. It's the Crashing Foothills. Footfalls? Yeah, Crashing Footfalls. Very good, Lib and correct answer. Obviously, when you have Crashing Footfalls in your opening hand, you suspend it for 0 mana, and you very quickly will have 2 4/4 Trumplers, and you are going to be so much ahead in this game, unless opponent has, I don't know, a counter spell of some sort. So yeah, correct answer. And shows you just how busted this card is, that it can basically, purely on the opening hand win rate, be one of the top cards in the format altogether. So yeah, I would say use both metrics and use them with context and with careful analysis. And I wouldn't just stick to one. It's easier just to get a general overview to look at only one of those. But if you want to have like deep insight into the format, you probably should be looking at both of them. Okay, question number 5. How does 17 lands users' win rate change over the set's life? How much does the win rate difference between strongest and weakest player diminish over the weeks? What events, such as quick draft introduction, alchemy set introduction, other sets maybe ranked cycles ending, etc., influence those? The question is from Jestem Tomkiem, one of my patrons and my compatriot. So thanks for that question. Okay, so first of all, the change of the win rate across the format length. This graph shows you the different sets. I took MKM, LCI, and WoW because they are the most recent ones, and numbers are which week it is. So I am looking at win rate based on the week of the format. And one thing that is universal in those 3 sets, and I think in most others, is that week 1 win rate of 17 lands users is much higher than any other week. It's been consistent across the formats, and it's mainly because 17 lands users are pretty much invested players, and because lots of non-invested players play in week 1. So it's a combination of disproportion in information and more people with low amount of information going into the format early, because they treat the first week on Arena like sort of prairies. Then there is usually a drop-off because, first of all, people know more. They catch up the information, so you don't have that. Hello, cat. You don't have that information advantage that you had in the first week. Yeah, are we going to now bother me? No, thank you. It is a huge cup, Dirty Nick. It is a huge cup. I do like my tea in more than half a liter volumes. This is the conditions I have to work with. What are you going to do now? You want to scratch? But I can't do it forever. I have to talk to people in the computer. You don't understand what a computer is? That's the thing that's in front of me most of the day if you don't disturb me. Okay. Let's go here. Good kitty. Okay. Are you going to try from a different angle? Yeah. Your slide is coming. Don't worry about it. Is he jealous of the chat? Yeah, this one is bigger than half a liter, so it's probably 0.7. That's pint and a half. Scott, are you going to attack the microphone now? Okay. I get it. Whew, right. So that the information disproportion becomes smaller, but also you lose a lot of players that were playing in this week one that allowed for that higher win rate. So the longer into the format you go, the more of the players that are playing are going to be the usuals that play 40 to 50 drafts a format or more than that even. And of course, it's much harder to win against players who play so much. But if you look at those data, at least in some of the formats, there seems to be an initial dip, and then after week 4, there is a slight resurgence of the win rate. And you can see that in LCI particularly, but also in the MKM, that the dip was around week 3, and from week 3 there is a slight improvement. It may be that people that don't like the format because they are losing are stopping to play, and therefore the win rate goes up naturally because a chunk of players that did poorly in the format just got bored with it because we don't like losing, do we? And to a lesser extent, we can see that also in WoW. However, we have this week 6 outlier when the win rate there drops to 54.5, which is the lowest of the format altogether. But we do see that there is a slight resurgence before that, so maybe that's just like a noise. Those differences are pretty small in case of WoW in general as well, so maybe that's the reason. Okay, question number 6. What are the most important mentality shifts that are needed for sealed? What is the weighing of curve versus power in success rates? What do you / top players? I'm really appreciate to the person asking that question that they separate me and top players as different categories. That's very, very conscious of them. What do you / top players look for in your preparation for a sealed tournament? Luckily, my days of preparing for sealed tournaments are over. The only one I prepare for is pre-release, which is arguably not high-stakes sealed tournament. And my preparation is also part of my content creation, so I don't have to do anything specific for that. But by the way, question from La Conquista. So first thing that you probably need to change in thinking is that drafters are in a couple of categories, but one category is definitely people that look for synergies. And sealed is more power driven than draft, and it's less reliant on synergy because you just rarely will get synergistic draft sealed pools. Other thing is that while in most draft formats, 2-color is the default deck, in sealed, in order to maximize power, you probably should start looking for playing 3 or maybe 4 colors, still having the main colors, but maybe splashing 2. And for that, fixing is essential for maximizing your power. One of the first things I do when I open a sealed pool is not look at the rares, but look at my lands fixing and try to see what can I do. Then when I have a good idea what can I do, I start to look at the cards, because if I know that I can only play a 2-color deck because I didn't get any fixing, I'm going to be probably looking for best 2 colors. If I know that I have fixing and color are not such a big obstacle for me, I'm starting to look for power at the top end. So I'm going to see, okay, which combination of colors get me most bombs? And then I try to make a deck that accommodates most of those bombs. While if I'm not having fixing, I'll probably look at still the same, but it will be very different, because then I start looking at uncommons as my tiebreaker, and which colors are deepest in terms of like powerful uncommons, for example. And I would want to play those colors most likely. If I was prepping for a big tournament like a GP or whatever the new GP things are during the Pro Tours that sometimes are in sealed, I would focus on sideboard plans. And this is something that we rarely train for. If you're drafting, we draft so much more best of one that sideboard plans are not at all in our scope. But also sideboard plans in draft are relatively simplistic. You have like those 4 or 5 cards that maybe you can put in. Maybe you can like put a couple of 2-drops when you play against a super aggressive deck, or maybe you can put some mediocre flyers when you need to deal with flyers and you know that you're going to lose the game through that. In sealed, sideboard plans can be whole transformative sideboarding plans where I'm starting with a blue-green controlling deck, and after game one, I sideboard into a white-red aggressive deck because I know that my slow deck does not stand a chance against opponent. So my best chance of trying is to try to get under them and sideboard completely to a different deck. And I think that training on how to build multiple decks from the same pool is one thing I would be focusing on if I'm playing a big tournament. Focusing on how to exchange 6-7 cards in order to optimize your deck. Finding out about which cards are particularly good against some bombs that I might see in game one. All those things will be interesting to me if I'm training for a big tournament, and I would focus on those things mainly because these are the things that you don't normally focus on when you're playing your run-of-the-mill drafts day in, day out. So yeah, that would be my advice about how to prepare for sealed. And obviously, simple things like knowing all the cards, making lists of combat tricks and memorizing them. These are all useful as well in sealed as in draft. Okay, question number 7. How do you prepare mentally for the grind of a longer tournament like an RCQ or RC as opposed to an FNM that is much shorter? Question from retro.exe. Hopefully no malware in that particular file. So I was always blessed with extreme endurance for long tournaments. And I did really well in GPs every time I played them because I'm playing as badly in round 8 as I did in round 1, while some people decrease their performance as the tournament goes longer. And this is my natural characteristic. I had like 16-hour drives, and I can focus on driving for 16 hours, no problem. And this was always a big benefit for me while playing those longer tournaments. But this is something genetic, so I can't tell you how to practice it. I don't know. I mean, try to drive longer and longer until you learn how to save your mental energy and have a good mix of heuristics and reactiveness, because that's the secret of it. You need to be operating on as little mental energy as possible, and at the same time you need to be as attentive that in a split second you can switch from energy saving modes into complete sharp and super reactive mode. By the way, hi to Thierry Ramboa, who is hopefully I'm going to check, who is raiding with a party of 88. Thank you very much for the raid. We're just answering questions from people that were asked on my Twitter, and these are diverse questions, from how to prep for a big tournament, which Thierry is probably a much better advisor than I am, to data-related questions. So hopefully, as you stay, we're going to answer some of the questions that you might find interesting yourselves. And if not, after I'm done with the questions from the people that I was prepared for, I might have some space for improvised questions if you have some. But things that I would give you an advice on if you want to prep for the longer tournaments. One is combating tilt, because you can't tilt on a longer tournament. There is just no chance of you surviving a game on a tilt and a long tournament. And you see that from the top players. They can go 0-2 in the big tournament, and then you switch on the coverage on Sunday and they are somehow in the top 8 because, well, they just shrugged off the first 2 losses and they moved on with their game and they proceeded game after game, and that requires having no tilt at all. My advice would be also try to work on eliminating any other worries. So be prepared, have all the stuff with you, um, plan your lunch, plan your stuff, and through that, eliminate any other kind of things that you might be thinking of instead of thinking about your games. And the third one is long tournaments are long. So I would limit my mental energy, not mental energy, mental energy drain between rounds. So yes, it's good to introspect about the game results if they're going to promote your gameplay in the next rounds. But it's not important to like solve riddles or focus on reminiscing of on things. Uh, I like to just keep my mental energy to minimum between the rounds. I can chat with my friends. I can chill, but I'm not going to do anything straining. Also, like if you have an option, if it's constructed, if you're playing longer tournaments, I usually played the decks that required less convoluted board states because these are particularly draining. Like I don't know if I would be willing to play a 9 round tournament with Amulet Titan. Um, but I'm happy to play an FNM with an Amulet Titan because I know that I have it in me that I can play 3 rounds. So these are some of the things that you can do to prepare for a longer tournament. But saving mental energy, I think, is the absolute essential skill. And if you practice it, it's going to be helpful in so many other areas of life. Question number 8. Oh God, did I answer it? No, I didn't answer it. I'll put it as a question of the week for the next week's seminar if I can. But yeah, I remember that I left one for later because I required to do a long analysis, and of course I didn't do it. So let's move to question number 9. How many podcasts do you regularly listen to, and how many different podcasts have you appeared on? And will you share an early behind-the-scenes story? From Nathan, asterisk. So I listen to a lot of podcasts because I walk the dog, and walking the dog gives you a lot of time to listen to podcasts. So my must listens are Limited Level Ups, Lords of Limited, Limited Resources, Jerry T podcast, and the Carnies. It's a Cockapoo Sand 101. So yeah, these are the ones that I listen to every week. Limited Level Ups, in my opinion, the best limited podcast that there is. I always listen to it. It changed how I play the format multiple times, so I highly recommend that one. Lords of Limited, equally. I do have Alex just a pip above. Limited Resources, I listen to know what the metagame is looking like and what people are thinking about. That's very important because I think that LR is the best weather vane of what would people be thinking and about the format in general. I only skip the episodes I'm guesting. Fair. Jerry T podcast is I'm listening to it because I don't know. I find Jerry Thompson. Whoa, whoa, whoa! What enemies? There is no rivalry there. Jerry T podcast I listen to because I somehow Jerry Thompson's brain is an incredible machinery, and I like to see how it operates. It's 99% of the time about constructed, but I do like to know what's going on in constructed, and I do like to listen about ideas, and especially big ideas in constructed, because I think that lots of them are transferable to limited, and that way I'm fishing for inspiration for my own content, trying to maybe find different analyses that I wouldn't have figured out because I'm focusing too much on limited while thinking about constructed. I can figure out some new ways of thinking about stuff. Another podcast I'm listening to every week is Carnies, Competitive Magic with Carnies from Andrea Mangucci, Javier Dominguez, and from Australia, Anthony Lee. All three of them are incredible magic brains. And I'm especially enamored by the way Javier Dominguez thinks about cards. And it's almost as if he understood the game, shockingly. But they have some really good in-depth discussion about different formats, and it's really inspiring as well to listen to how they look at the game, how top players can get small edges from decisions they make. They have an excellent episode on Mulligan last week when they are going through a bunch of hands, and you don't even need to have a working understanding of constructed to follow it, but the concepts that they are discussing are so mind-opening about why should you mulligan this hand with this deck but not with the other deck, and how building a plan in much more details that we're used to looks like. So it's been a brilliant episode, and generally the podcast is quite brilliant. Also, I mean, I didn't put it on the list, but I listen every week to Drafting Archetypes from Sam Black, and again, Sam Black, amazing magic brain. I mean, whatever happens, the answer from Sam would be, yeah, draft this archetype in such a way that you can draw your whole deck. But beyond that point, he naturally understands how data works, how to interpret it, when to ignore it, and how to look at cards and assemble them into decks. That's actually, you know, when you think about it, our drafting skeletons archetype, the drafting skeletons episode we release every time before the set is being released is inspired by Sam's Black idea of draft deck skeletons, and we just shifted the concept here and there to fit our format, and that spawned the whole genre of our skeleton analysis instead of set review. Apart from that, I recommend listening to Limited Edition from Metal Mario and Infinite Breakfast, Dominaria's Judgment from Dom Harvey and Ari Lax, midweek metagame, that's Canister and Gabriel Nassif, and Grindcast, which I started listening to recently, and I really enjoy it. It's like not done by the top pro players, but it's very informative, and I actually like how the presenters are approaching the game. Also, I'm listening to constructive criticism. Also, a pretty good look into constructed. Then I have my relaxing podcasts in Casual Magic from Shivan Bhatt, Humans of Magic, and MTG Goldfish. These are more, you know, general kind of MTG news slash interviews with people that I normally would not have an idea exist because I'm not in the Commander scene, but it's interesting to listen to what's going on in broader Magic. I do listen every week to Drive to Work with Mark Rosewater. That's also pretty good for understanding how sets are designed through, you know, I sometimes think that Mark Rosewater is so underestimated in how much content he created. And right now it's on episode 1000 something of the Drive to Work. And also, he is a great designer of the game. And sometimes I feel like he's being treated like this wacky uncle, which is a persona I think he cultivates a bit, but there's quite some good in-depth information about the design process of the game. And also, there are frequent guests from the design teams, and it's also very interesting to listen to those. And then I have some non-magic podcasts that I try to listen. Half-Assed History from Riley Knight, 538 podcast, The Bugle from Andy Zaltzman. That's the sort of The Bugle is what spawned the career of Oliver. What's his name? John Oliver. There you go. And Off Menu, that's Ed Gamble and James Acaster. They're two British comedians that invite people to talk about their dream menu and talk about food, which is also a great entertainment. Yeah. Mara also is a good MTG historian because it's easy to be a historian of something when you created half of that history. So yeah. Okay, so that's the selection of the podcasts I listen to, and definitely there are some that I didn't mention. I Love You, Mana, I do listen to occasionally. I don't even know how to classify it, and there's plenty of podcasts that stop being there. My biggest pain is that the Bash Bros podcast is no longer there. It was fun with Brad Nelson, with Corey Baumeister, and Brian. Brian Doohan. How was his name? Yeah, I Love You Mana is a highly specific acquired taste, and Belly would know as he is one of the creators of it. Yeah, that's a lot, isn't it? I do like to walk the dog. Also, I cook, and while cooking, I also listen to podcasts. Right now, the second part of the question was which podcast I visited. I've been on Limited Level Ups. I've been on LR. I've been on the First Pick podcast, which is an Italian-speaking podcast about Limited, and I managed to run a whole episode of podcasts in Italian somehow. Draft Chuff, I've been a guest on. Unfortunately, Draft Chuff is stopping its activity as of next week. They're going to be on YouTube after that. Limited edition, I've been several times on. Casual Magic with Shivam, I've been a guest once. Draft Lab podcast, that was a good one. Unfortunately, that one is also on hiatus. Arena Craft podcast, that one is also on hiatus. I've been to I Love You Mana twice. That's also something on my list. I still want to appear on a couple of podcasts I have not collected in my collection of things that I've been guesting. Notably, I've never been to Lords of Limited, and that's something that's on the bucket list there. So if you're listening, Ben and Ethan, we can always think of something. I know how Ben loves data. Yeah, but these are the ones that I've been a guest on. And any stories? I mean, does anyone want to know how sausages are being made of? I do like the one of the better stories of my podcast visits was actually the I Love You Mana podcast. I Love You Mana, despite its name that suggests magic, is not really focusing on magic. It's focusing on madness that is the life of their creators. However, one of the co-hosts is a magic player, and he's actually my patron. And he invited me to be a guest because he wanted to talk more about magic. And first time we did it, and we talked a bit about magic, and then we went a bit into madness. Second time when we went there, I decided to, because part of that podcast taste is abstract humor, I decided to go completely ballistic and start being aggressive towards the person that invited me and ally with his nemesis, Mike Lester, and basically turned his dream of having me as a guest on the podcast into the worst nightmare of getting berated by me. And then, of course, we turned that into a joke because it was a joke, and all was good. And Zach is still my friend. We're going to record the skeletons next week, so all is good in that department. Question number 10. If you feel like reminiscing, boy, do I. What is your favorite memory / story of when you first started playing MTG? Do you have any bright memories of how you got into Limited? I don't know. One memory that I have is how I started to play, and I was in Germany for some reason as high school exchange, and I saw this starter pack for 5th edition, and I just knew it's for me. I knew I had no idea what it was. I knew it's for me. I knew it's cards, and I knew it's fantasy linked, and I just bought it. And I, like 3 months later, I was in my first pro release or something. My favorite memory when I started, well, I went to draft very quickly. So I bought my first cards. I started playing relatively quickly. I started playing tournaments pretty quickly. And my brother started playing, so we just were grinding like 40, 60 hours a week. Every moment after school was just playing Magic with my brother. And we played Limited mainly by playing from the single pile of cards fished out from our big box of random commons. And that taught me a lot of flexibility. And then at some stage, it was the moment, I guess, to start playing more seriously and going to bigger tournaments. And I was not like really, I knew that the EV of traveling was pretty bad. So I didn't want to go to GPs outside of my hometown. Me and my brother, we're 2.5 years apart. I'm older. But there was a GP in Prague, and my brother in the end convinced me to go with him because my parents were not super keen on letting him go on his own. Uh, so I, in the end, okay, I'm just going to go and play. It was the time, like I had 0 buys, and you had to get to day 2 by having, I think, what's going 6-1-1. I think that was the minimum that got you to day 2. I opened some kind of complete thrash pool, but I decided to put a bunch of bombs together and hope for the best. And I went 6-1-1. And then I went 4-2 on day 2, and I managed to squeeze out 17th out of 700 people. And also, it was the time when rookies had much better prizes. So basically, I think only the winner of that GP won more than I did, because I won the top amateur prize. That was like $2,000. And that was a great moment. I mean, that basically sparked me going to GPs much more frequently. And also, I mean, I think I day 2'd my first 5 GPs at that stage. So things were going well. And this, again, when we talked about the preparation for the tournament, I was really, really good in playing log tournaments because I just had a flat level of play independent of how long the tournament was lasting. But for me, like, the biggest memories of those early days was pre-releases of 70 people. These were great because in those times you had like one pre-release per city of the size of Warsaw, so everyone who wanted to play was going for that one pre-release, and it was fun to play a bigger pre-release event that took the whole Saturday rather than 3 rounds. Nowadays, it's just doesn't have that magic. And of course, the fact that you were competing for a magnificent prize of a T-shirt, I think that the T-shirt prizes were really good, and I think that that's one thing that is missing from the organized play right now. Okay, well, that's enough of reminiscing. Let's move to the maybe more serious talk about data analysis. Why wouldn't we? How do you prevent yourself from falling into your biases, preferences while drafting? Like if you have a tendency to draft certain colors or archetypes. And the question is from Searing Blaze 88. So my answer is that you always fall into biases, and there's no escaping that. And understanding that is absolutely the key. Because if you understand your biases and that you fall into them, you can find them easier. Knowing them specifically is even more important. I try to be very conscious of the biases I'm doing. I know that I'm making a wrong pick. I want to make that pick, and no one is stopping me. And there will be a moment when I will have to stop and say, okay, but at a certain stage, this pick is becoming too detrimental, and I'm going to stop it. And that's how I control it. But I think that the pinnacle of understanding your bias is to embrace them and enjoy them, and stop caring about min-maxing everything, and appreciate that you have certain biases. I mean, Sam Black wouldn't be Sam Black if he didn't have a strong bias towards the early decks that try to loop things. And being really great in that is what makes Sam Black Sam Black. So I think embracing your biases while understanding them fully is something that you should be aiming at rather than avoiding biases. Question number 12. Did you have a favorite archetype color pair to draft in MKM? It's from Bicycle. So my favorite archetype was blue-green with splash. And here is an example of my, I think, favorite deck from this format I drafted. First of all, what I like is a perfect U-shaped curve. So here you can see there is 10 2-drops, 2 3-drops, 2 4-drops, 2 5-drops, and like 6 6-drops or more. And that's the kind of a deck that I like to draft. I have a lot of stuff that I can do early. Bunch of this stuff that I can do early is also good late, because I have Flourishing Bloomkin. I have 2 Bubble Smugglers that can be upgraded to 6-drops because I need more 6-drops. I have a bunch of Repulsive Mutations, which are 2-drops but not really 2-drops. Nervous Gardeners that help me fuel my addiction to mana. Then Forensic Researcher and Project Inspector in 3-drops, just to give some card selection. And then I have Vanifar as my bomb of the deck, and Out Cold to control the board. and then Killer, Among Us, and Coerce to Kill, 2 cards that you always should put in your blue-green decks, and a bunch of 6 drops. I have the Hellion, Topiary Panther, 2 Crocodiles, Glint Weaver, and Hotshot Investigators. So that's an example of like the blue-green deck that I like to draft. This one didn't even trophy, but I still loved it. Vanifar with Bubble Smugglers and Flourishing Bloomkins is just a sick combination, and I loved it. Then the other things that I liked, but I never got into, was blue-red. Unfortunately, I never found myself in the lane that blue-red was open. I did manage to do it once, and I had this beautiful 7-win deck with 2 Gleaming Gear Drakes, 2 Torch the Witness. I had Gadget Technician, Satchel, Ill-Timed Explosion, the blue-red Wrath, and Kylex Volt Strider, the mythic vehicle, the 4/4 that can exile cards from your graveyard and then cast spells that were exiled with it instead of crewing. That was great. I really like that deck. And the last thing, I think, no, not. I don't think it's the last one. Another deck that I really liked, and that's my own device, and I think it was the pinnacle of my achievement in this format, was making the Case of the Pilfered Proof work, where I drafted a deck that was a white-green detective decks. I had 3 Novice Inspectors. Okay, that does help. 2 Vitugazi Inspectors, a Perimeter Enforcer, 2 Case File Auditors. There was a Teysa in there as well, because it was Abzan. 2 Granite Witnesses, Gryffindor Tracker, Loxodon Eavesdropper, all of those are detectives. Museum Nightwatch that can make a detective, and Case of the Locked Hothouse. So I had 3 cases. I also had Makeshift Binding as an enchantment that I could look for. Basically, in this deck, I was not aggressive, and I think that this is the requirement to play the Case of the Pilfering Proof, because I don't want to play my aggressive deck, because my aggressive decks, I don't have space where I can cast that spell. While in my defensive deck, I'm happy to cast it on turn 2, and on turn 3, I cast the Case File Auditor, make it a 2/5. Look maybe for one of the cases, one more case, or the Makeshift Binding, and I clog the board enough that opponent doesn't have very good attacks for me. And then I can start going through my deck. Because I have those 2 cases of the Pilfering Proof and so many detectives, I solve them quite easily, which means another trigger from Case File Auditor, which means that in this particular deck, I was almost deterministic to find the Case of the Locked Hothouse, which eventually will be solved because I'm clogging the board. And the games with this deck played like that I basically did this. I went to the Case of the Locked Hothouse, and maybe the second case of the Pilfering Proof, and then at some stage I started casting those Granite Witnesses and Gryffindor Tracker, making them 5/4 attackers, and through that I was winning every single game. So it was sweet, and it was a fringe case where actually the Case of the Pilfered Proof was an excellent card because of the making everything that I did much more defensive. So Novice Inspector as a 2/3 is a great card. It's already good as a 1/2. Perimeter Enforcer as a 2/2, much better. And Case File Auditors as a 2/5s are also great. Then they also were easily solved, which triggered the Case File Auditor, so that gives me extra card draw. Treacherous Greed was great, strictly with the Inspector, but sometimes when I already got all my enchantments from the deck, I just jammed with the Case File Auditor and then sacrificed it afterwards, because I don't have much use for it anymore, because I have an active Case of the Locked Hothouse. The only problem was that I sometimes was flying close to the sun with milling myself, or not even milling myself out, by drawing too many cards and ending up with no library. This deck's main weakness was lack of any kind of super top-end finisher. It would be perfect if I had a doppelgang in this deck, and that would have been amazing. Okay, and the last one, a sort of a Gruul aggro splashing Aurelia and War Leader Skull. This is the one that got away, because I think that this deck should have I should have played better with it. I didn't trophy because of the punts I made in some games, but it had Thirsty Witness, 2 Dog Walkers, Bloomkin, couple of Gardeners, Tunnel Tipsters, Fanatical Strength, and it had like a bunch of rares. I had a case of the Crimson Pulse, War Leader's Call, Yarus, Roar of the Old Gods, Hide in Plain Sight, Aurelia, and 2 copies of Killer Among Us, plus Hustle Bustle, which was also great with my plentiful cards that have disguise. So really sweet Gruul Aggro, Splashing, Aurelia, and War Leader's Call. And yeah, I didn't play that deck optimally, and that made me sad. Okay, that's the sort of like my highlight stories of the MKM, including my favorite archetype, which was blue-green. Question 13. I'd like to try and parse trends that are unique amongst high result players. I think there is a lot of herding tendencies for the base data. And question is from TBS, the Ben Sack. You may know from limited resources flashback episodes. So I've put a couple of things that top players do differently. First thing is less mulliganing. Consistently across many formats, top players mulligan less and best of one. Then there is 2 opposite things that best people do. First, later in the format, they are more diverse drafters. So their draft patterns are more diverse in the late format. But at the same time, they have more uniform patterns in the early format, which means that they are capable of being flexible and drafting everything in the format as they got more knowledge. But early in the format, top players tend to abuse the most open strategy that people missed on. Like, for example, classic pattern for MKM would be first week, draft Boros, and from then on, you start drafting everything that is possible because this format allowed to draft almost every color combination. And that's typical for the top players, that they are both flexible but also opportunistic. Complex cards have higher win rates in the hands of top players, and that's something that I observed set after set. I have a couple of episodes that I exclusively dedicated to what do top players do differently, and they are format specific, but not necessarily without any universal takeaways. So if you're interested more in-depth answers to those questions, I would refer you to my old episodes, learning from best players, learning from top players. I think I have like 3 of those from different sets, and all of them look at the data from the cards from those formats, but try to answer most of universal questions about what top players do differently. And then one thing that I definitely found is that build around cards, Magic Christmas Lands cards, and situational cards make their decks less often. But when they do, they have a disproportionately high win rate compared to the other groups of players. So not only they win the same as the difference between the player levels, but slightly more. So the difference between top players' win rate and middle tier players' win rate will be will be larger for those cards. Question 14. You mentioned tossing out early data in the Walla Oompa episode. That's an episode I did with Eduardo Scheigalik about how to train pro players. And don't worry, I was not explaining how to train pro players. Eduardo is a specialist on running team meetings for pro tour teams unlimited. But I mentioned that you should probably chuck out early data from 17 lands from your analysis, especially late in the format, because most games are played early, but also the metagame early looks very different from metagame late in the game. So Fake Jake Brown is asking, is this arbitrary, or does the data actually shake out a certain point? Does this change from set to set, or is there a number of days we can always disregard? Very good question, Fake Jake Brown. Who is also helping me with releasing this podcast, so I had to answer that question. First of all, these are 2 different sets. This graph is white cards from Murders in Karlov Manor and how their alsa changed over time. The higher the graph, the earlier the card is being picked. So for example, this is Novice Inspector. It was picked somewhere between picks 3 and 4 early in the format, and late in the format it was picked between picks 3 and 2 on average. And as you can see, because white was so good in this format, evaluation of white cards in some especially good white cards changed as the format progressed. And somewhere here it reached equilibrium. And when you look at this and you check when that happened, it's going to be roughly after 2 weeks. These are red cards from Lost Caverns of Ixalan. And you see the same increase of those cards as they are being picked higher and higher, especially the good ones. And then stabilizes. And the alpha of the cards doesn't change an iota from that moment. It just oscillates around the average, but the average stays roughly the same. And if you will look at those numbers, this is also 2 weeks exactly. And if you look at any other format, you will most likely find that after 2 weeks, the metagame stabilizes, and before that, it's chaotic. And that's why I would always trim 2 weeks if I have enough data. Obviously, if I'm looking at the week 2 situation, I can't just trim 2 weeks. But after 4 weeks already, you can easily discard the first 2 weeks of the format. And there are some cards that will be late bloomers. The one time I had the pleasure of being on Mystic Studies, and pleasure it was, trust me, as Sam is such an amazing person. We were talking about the evolution of alpha of the cards in Dominaria United, and one card in that format was different than anything we can see here. It was Negate, which slowly increased in how people were treating it throughout the format, even late, like 6 weeks into it got picked higher and higher. Because it started very low, as people thought it was strictly a sideboard card, and the longer the format lasted, the more people realized this is actually a main deckable card, and took some time. But for those non-obvious cards, it will be different. For most cards, 2 weeks is going to be the cutoff point. Okay, question number 15. Can you do some thoughts on how changing from 15 to 14 cards per pack with play boosters changes the chances of wheeling cards? Question from XX Gimli XX, aka Marius Schwarze, who is a German pro player, modo grinder, limited grinder in general, excellent limited player. So happy to answer Marius's question. I think he was on the last Pro Tour as well. So yeah, a really good follow if you are on a mixture of nonsense and good limited decks that are slightly off the beaten trail. So here is the curve of what is the probability of winning a card if you open it, pack 1, pick 1. Nerdy Steve, always with the words of wisdom. And you roughly will have, this is the data from LCI, so from the old style of boosters. And you roughly have at ALSA 6.2-ish, you will have roughly a 50% chance of wheeling a card. At ALSA of roughly 8, you will have 80% chance of wheeling a card that you open in the first pack. These cards are quite consistent. And, at ALSA 4.3, you'll have roughly 20% of chance of winning the card. And here, these are the cards that almost always wheel. They have ALSA of above 8. And this is the same curve for Murders in Karlov Manor. And 20% is still around 4.3 ALSA. So you got 20% chance of wheeling that card. 50% is roughly 6. It's actually 5.9. So there's a slightly lower ALSA to wheel the card 50% of the time. So there's a slightly changed numbers here. 80% chance of wheeling is going to be roughly 7.5 ALSA. So again, slightly smaller than it used to be. And those cards that almost always wheel above 8, they just don't happen because the packs are smaller. So generally, the cards that are really good or are really highly picked, and probably these are the ones that you want to be wheeling, don't change that much in their probability of being wheeled as the format changed. as the pack changed. There is a small shift. You're slightly less likely to wheel cards that have a higher alsa, but that's fine. The change is not dramatic. And of course, it changes that you have fewer opportunities of wheeling cards because you will only wheel 5, not 6, and that's a big thing. But I think that at least in this set, they trimmed enough of these chaffy commons that Ulave, you're a person of wisdom. You are much less likely to get the 15th card now. That is correct. But yeah, generally there is some change. The change is not massive. And you might feel it, but I think that a lot of the discussion I see about wheeling and how people say that it's harder to wheel things might have more to do with the preference in color than with actual wheeling situation. I think that there's been this moment when white has been hard cut and people try to wheel white average cards and they never see them back because white is so heavily contested. That's my gut feeling. I don't have data to support it. All right. Question number 16. What is the best way to find and analyze for synergies? Number of copies of a card in the deck, card A plus card B deltas. And it's from Wala Umpa, aka Eduardo Shaigalik, my guest from a couple of weeks ago. So specifically looking at A plus B synergy when you have two cards, there are two ways of looking at it. You can look at synergistic win rates when both cards are in the deck. But that data is noisy because, of course, having two cards in the deck doesn't mean you draw both of them, and that's a problem. So there will be a lot of noise in that, and we're going to talk about why there is noise in a second when we have a different question. And the other one is you look at win rates when both cards are drawn. The problem with that is that data is biased towards longer games because, of course, the longer the game, the more chance that you're going to draw both cards. And of course, not every card is synergistic in a way that you want to have a long game with it. But generally, yes. I mean, synergy cards, you probably want to play longer games because you actually, for that reason, you want to maximize the probability of drawing both cards. So looking at both of those things can be useful to find good synergies. And by synergistic win rates, I mean, you look at the win rate of card A, you look at the win rate of card B, you look at the win rate of decks that contain card A and card B. If that win rate is higher than either the win rate of card A in a deck or card B in a deck, you can sort of assume that these cards probably work in a synergistic fashion. If the win rate is higher than half the difference between the win rates of the both cards, then it's moderately synergistic. And then if it's lower than the win rate of each card individually, then it's antagonistic, actually, the relationship with those two cards. Now, the bias towards longer games will be disproportionately affecting some cards. So keep that in mind when you're looking at for aggressive synergies. Like if you want to look at the combo of, I don't know, like aggressive flying creature and equipment, like a Goldvein pick, you might find that drawing both of those cards is actually detrimental because you will draw them more frequently, both in the same game when that game lasted 10 turns and you're not favored in winning games that last 10 turns. So it might be lowered by the fact that you only collect data from those longer games, or not only, but disproportionately collect the data from those longer games. Because in most games that end at turn 6, you didn't draw both of those cards. So that's the problem. If you're looking for the cards, if you have multiple copies, same applies. I would check the win rates of how many copies you have, what is the win rate of a deck that has 3 copies of this and 2 copies. And if it increases over time, then I would think that those cards are pretty self-synergistic, or collectibles, whatever nomenclature you choose to pick. Okay. Question 17. All the recent talk about winning the coin flip has made me wonder about mulligans. Have you ever looked at mulligans and whether they are more punishing in some sets than others for some color pairs / vectors, play / draw, etc.? And the question comes from Ben Fisher, aka the only remaining member of the Draft Chaff podcast, which will be thoroughly missed. Okay. So yeah, I did analyze mulligans several times, and you can find it peppered into some of my episodes. I never did an episode on mulligan, and I think that this way overdue. So maybe if there is time in Outlaws of the Thunder Junction, I might do an episode that focuses on strictly mulligan decisions and when are they good and when are they not so good. So here you have the win rate of each archetype in Murders at Karlov Manor. General win rate, and this is the win rate when mulligan has been taken. And there is a roughly 13-14% percentage points difference between the games without mulligan and with mulligan. So for example, Boros has 56.5% win rate, 43% win rate after mulliganing. And Selesnya has 55.5, 42% when it's mulligan. So mulligan in best of one is a massive hit in win rate. And there is no particular trend, but there are some archetypes that have higher punishment for taking a mulligan. And in this set, and I don't know why, because I didn't do a very thorough analysis of the problem and I didn't look at from multiple angles, but Izzet is the archetype that has a consistently higher, larger difference between games where you mulligan and when you didn't in terms of win rate. And here we have the same data, but on the play, because Ben was asking if there is any kind of trend with on the play or on the draw. On the play, the punishment for taking a mulligan is actually higher than on the draw. So when we had, here we had average of around 14%, 13%. If you're looking at the mulligan rate on the play, you will get more of 15, even 16%. So very few archetypes are lower than 14. So yeah, that means, of course, that you will get more like 12, 11 percentage points difference in win rate when you are on the draw. And yeah, one archetype that has a lower difference between win rate on the mulligan is Dimir. But I think that this has something to do not only with Dimir dealing with mulligan better, but also with Dimir not dealing with winning well in general. So it has the lowest win rate of all the archetypes, but actually it doesn't have the lowest win rate when it mulligans. So yeah, there is some resilience to mulligans from Dimir deck. And I'm sure that will be very format specific, and I still need to make a more rigorous analysis to see if there are particular types of decks that mulligan better or less good. And it doesn't have to do, for example, with number of early plays in the deck or reliance on drawing multiple pieces of synergy. Okay, this is the question that so many of you have been waiting for. I'm patiently waiting for the Q&A about how to get your cat to hike off leash with you. And the question comes from the Jordan. So I wish I had better news, but my cat famously walks with me for long walks with the dog without the leash and just follows me. And then we do between 1.5 and 2 miles every day. So here's the picture from one of our walks in the local woods. And yeah, the cat just walks behind. The dog runs around like an idiot. The cat stays with me and then goes to sleep on the step of my door. Here is also my cat in the crown because my daughter made him a crown and he had to wear it. There was no discussion. She was, I think, 7 then. My cat was always dog-like. He is a mix of a normal tabby and a Maine Coon. So his dad was a Maine Coon. He doesn't have any long fur, but he's much bigger than a normal cat and also has a much more dog-like personality like Maine Coons have. So he was always walking with us. It was always hard to shake him off when we went for a walk in the area. once we got the dog, he just decided, oh, well, the dog goes for a walk. I'm going for a walk as well. And there's nothing you can do about it. It's actually impossible to leave him home. I sometimes give him food and then he doesn't follow us when I think that it's a particularly bad day, or if it's a weekend and I know there will be plenty of people with dogs in the forest, and I don't feel like carrying the cat for half of the walk while he's scratching my face, because he wants to attack every dog that he sees. Yeah, that's another thing that my cat does. He just attacks dogs randomly, and so far none of the dogs called his bluff. So I guess it's a win. But I don't think you can train a cat, or at least I don't have the capacity of training a cat to walk without the lead. But I do have a capacity of having a very sweet cat that behaves a bit like a dog, but is cat-like enough that it doesn't feel weird. So yeah, it's been a true blessing. He's been with us for 14 years and hopefully for many years to come. Question 19. Downbringer, but maybe I can give you some optimism from that question too. How do you find the potential variance for a card's real game in hand win rate? For example, if a card has a listed 59% game in hand win rate with 3,000 total games it's been played, what might a good total range for its expected true game in hand win rate be? Is there some kind of formula for the range? The question comes from Robbie Strong Morse, who is on Twitter at the year was 1778. And why I'm telling you that is that Robbie is 14. Robbie is also qualified for the RC. And, in the current era, we have so few young players that look like they're going to be potentially, if they stick to playing Magic, potentially a pro player material. And if there is one, then Robbie definitely is it. So if you want to jump on the bandwagon of following a future, RC winner / Pro Tour competitor, that's the place to go. So Robbie is a long-time follower, always asks very good questions, and you can see that he is focusing on the game in a way that spells well for his future career in the competitive play. But question is very good. Sampling error is the thing that you need to calculate, and you can find the calculators online, which is very easy. For instance, I found this one. Just click on it, and it literally asks you what is the sample size and what is the proportion in the sample, and you put in those two things, and it will calculate you the error. So the 95% range, which you can say that with 95% probability, the actual real result is within this bracket. And for this particular example from the question, it is plus minus 1.7 percentage points. So the real answer for the 59% win rate card with 3,000 games sample will be somewhere between 57.3 and 60.7% win rate. So that's where you have to look for the answer for that. Hopefully that's helpful. No, above 90. So the question from Nerdy Steve, I'm going to put it on the screen, is the odds of Magic players complaining about bomb rares ruining a limited environment above or below 99%? No, it's above 99%. I'm not saying 99% of people complain, but the chances of someone complaining about bombs is going to be 100% for each format. Even if there are no rares in it, there's still going to be some sort of bomb. So what is your most played draft format on 17 lands? Is this also your favorite one? Rich Anderson question. Another long-time follower, so happy to answer. My most played format is Kaldheim. But it's mainly because of the earlier sets data purge. So there is some data from my 17 lands that disappeared because there was a change in draft logging and it was not compatible with how the site currently works. If there was no data purge like that, it should have been Ikoria. I'm pretty sure I played over 100 Ikoria drafts. I had more than 35 trophies in that format as well. So it was a combination of it went well and I liked it and I had fun with it. And I almost never drafted the cycling deck because I hated it. So I basically managed to get like a really good win rate, a high trophy rate without drafting the scourge of the format. I maybe had like one cycling draft. I had many cycling drafts, but they were never white red. And based on Zenith Flare, I had a bunch of blue red draft cycling decks when I was using cycling to fuel my 3-2 Wolverine into double strike and stuff like that. Unfortunately, since I started creating content, I draft less, and I never can break more than 40 drafts in a format. I rarely get over 30. Actually, I'm consistently doing um, well, no, per month. I would say I consistently do like 25 drafts a month, or 20 to 25 drafts a month. And my favorite draft format is still Ikoria. Uh, and also Ikoria with the old companion rule, because that was the best draft experience that you can get. Umori did nothing wrong. And new companion rule just limits how you can use them in draft. I do understand that for constructed it's a problematic mechanic, but there's nothing stopping people from playing this format with old companion rule in limited, because why wouldn't you? Old companion rule in limited, Nerdy Steve, not in constructed. In constructed, it's impossible that this rule can exist. It shouldn't exist and should never been made. But in limited, it's fun because you can play Umori, for example, and you can't play Umori with the new companion rule. So yeah, it limits the issues. Umori died for our sins, Belly Television. You're preaching to the choir here. I mean, drafting Umori deck was a real drawback. It's like, okay, it is still busted on Lurus, and that was the problem card in limited. I'm not gonna question that, but on cards like Zerda, on cards like Umori, on cards like even Yorion, I mean, playing 60 cards in that format was pretty much detrimental. So you didn't get that big benefit of companioning Yorion. But a bunch of those cards could only exist with the old companion rule, and it was not fun with Lurus, I admit. And Lutri was just such an easy one to do, that was maybe a problem. Okay, question 21. Could you go into the differences between games played win rate and game in hand win rate, and how they should be used in what situation? From Lauris 0.1. Okay, this is a great question because it brings us back to the basics of how to read the most commonly seen data from the 17 lands. So first of all, games played win rate gives us information about card power and archetype power, because when we have data for games played, only between 40 and 60% of the games you draw the actual card that you're looking at. So a bunch of the information that you get from there is strictly on the cards surrounding the cards that you're looking at. That's quite a lot. So roughly half of the data does not even see the card. But it tells us about what surrounds it, so the archetypes that the card is being played. If there are disproportions, you will see that the card can have a higher win rate because it's disproportionately played, for example, in Izzet decks and never played in Rakdos decks. And seeing the games played win rate will not tell you, but it will have that part of information. If you look at the more specialized games played win rate, when you look only at a particular archetype, which of course with 17 lands you can easily do, you have even more specific information about the surroundings of the card. Because it shows you not only the power of the card, but the power of things that this card is played in, it's a much better metric to follow early in the draft. If you have an pack one, pick one situation, it's much better to look at the games played win rate in making decisions. And the card with a higher games played win rate will be the better first pick if you would follow just the data blindly in a draft. Because by picking the card with the highest gameplay win rate, you're not only selecting the card, but you're also selecting, is it in good places? So that's something to keep an eye on. Game in hand win rate has much more information about the card because you only are focusing on the 40% of the games that this card was in the deck that it has been drawn, or the 50% or 60, whatever. But it has some biases that are included in it. And for example, drawing a card requires a longer game, so disproportionately you will have data from longer games, which is not always good for some cards that are good in short games, because of course, if you have a bias towards longer games, you will see that card more frequently in the games that you are on the back foot in. So it will have some kind of adjustment that needs to be done. These are the two main things to think about when you're looking at the games played and game and hand win rate data. Also, as you progress with your draft, you should move more into specific data for an archetype that you're drafting in order to understand, because cards can have a high game in hand win rate and game played win rate or something, but it might be because it's disproportionately played in Selesnya and you're drafting not Selesnya, but you're drafting Azorius. And in Azorius, that card is actually pretty bad. So specifying your data, looking only through Azorius decks, you will have a better idea whether you are interested in the card or not. And of course, these are only numbers. You shouldn't be the slave of them. You can use them to inform your picks, but you should also supplement that information with your own preferences, because preferences are important. People, I think, put too much weight on data and not enough of on their personal preferences, and because of that, they start drafting things that they don't understand how to play. While if they followed their preferences, they would be in a better situation. But also, you will get context of other cards that you already have that might change the pure numerical order of the cards based on their win rate. Because I don't know, sometimes I'm drafting, like I showed you just a couple of minutes ago, my green-white defensive detective deck. And you might look at the green-white win rates of the cards and you will see, oh yeah, no, that the top cards are the aggressive ones like Insight Source or I don't know, Fanatical Strength. And I don't want Fanatical Strength in my defensive detective 1/3 tribal, because that's not the card I want in that particular deck. I want some other things. And at this moment, I switch off the looking at the numbers and I switch on my intuition, my understanding, my fundamentals of the game. And this is the way to look at the data, because I think that it maybe turns into a bit of a rant, but I mean, people like I can't be accused of not liking data. I mean, if anything, quite the opposite. But understanding data, it means knowing also when to disregard. Data is sort of like heuristics in this way that 80% of the time it works, but important thing about heuristics is to know when is this 20% that it doesn't work. And it's the same with data. Like it works probably even 90% of the time, but the 10% that it doesn't, you need to understand that doesn't work. And only through understanding of the data and understanding how it's built and what it encompasses, you can actually consciously disregard it. And that's why understanding data is so important, because you know when to disregard it if you understand it fully. Whew. Let's move to question number 22. Can you use 17 lands data to prove/disprove whether Premier or traditional draft pair opponents by record? My personal data suggests Premier doesn't, but I'm less sure about traditional. And the question is from everybody's favorite son. That's it. That's the nickname. Everybody's favorite son. Okay, so short answer is yes, you can. You can do it, but it's a hellish job. In order to do it, you need to get replay data, the least commonly analyzed data set from 17 lands. I think that good chance I'm one of the 3 people that ever looked into replay data. It's amazing. The data is amazing. It's just so hard to analyze it, because you have every action of the game somehow written down in a data format, which means that for every turn of the game, you have like 10 columns for one player, 10 columns from the other player. Then you have the second part of the turn cycles with equally 10 columns here, 10 columns there. And how I would go on to do that is I would basically pick some later turn, like turn 5, and tried to find games that have mirroring parts of the. So let's say if I did something on my turn 5 and I played against another 17 lands user, in their data, what I did on my turn will be in their data set what my opponent did on their turn. If I compare those two things and I find that there are pairs of games that have identical turn 5, and then maybe I can verify if that's really the same game by comparing also the turn 7 of those both games. If that is the case, that it's the same game, I can look then at the record of both players at the start of the game and figure out from there whether they were paired because they had exactly the same record at that stage of the draft when they were paired against each other. Now, anecdotally, because I did play several games against people who I know and we compared our records, anecdotally, it's far from perfect. Like recently, I lost a game to uh, Mark Anderson, that you might know from doing the set previews with protocols. And he sent me the message, yeah, that's fine. You're still 4-1, aren't you? And I was like, no, I'm out of this draft. Oh, I'm 4-0 right now. So I thought that you will be 3-1 or something. I thought that you'd be only 3-1, but in fact, I was 4-3 at that stage. So I was kicked out. We definitely didn't have the same record at that stage. And it happened time and time again that I'm being paired against someone who was, I don't know, I was 2-0 in the traditional draft, and my opponent turned out that they were 0-1 at that stage, and we were paired against each other. So clearly, it's not 100% proof. But it would be maybe interesting to do that analysis. Is just I'm even dreading the idea of trying to compare the so many data sets and what computing power it would require. If someone is good in coding, probably you can code that comparison and maybe get it easier. But yeah, matching algorithm is one of the remaining mysteries of how Arena works, and it would be interesting if someone cracked it. But I already cracked the hand smoother, so I think I'm excused and I don't have to crack another part. Let's leave it to someone else because I dread that analysis. It would kill my computer as well. Question number 23. Is there a way to check quick draft data to understand bot tendencies? And that comes from Raul Venturi. Great question. Answer is obvious yes. And here is the simplest way to do it. I plotted against each other alpha of each common in the set against its game and win rate. And not only I did this, but also I colored each dot at the same color as the color that from which the common is. I skipped the multicolor stuff because it was just too confusing in the graph. But generally, you can see that bots pick white cards very highly because the alpha is low between 2 and 3. Flapagoon, I just figured out how exactly it works and what are the rules that govern it. I don't know what the actual equation that makes it looks like, because you can solve the same equation in multiple ways. But I can tell you exactly what are the odds of drawing each hand type, depending on how many lands you have in your deck. But okay, let's go back to the cracking the bots. So yeah, of the top 10 cards in the format in terms of like how high they are picked by the bots, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. 8 of them are white, and well, top 11, and 3 of them are red. So white is picked very highly by the bots, which means that white will not be very frequently open in the bot draft. And that, some of those white cards that are picked super highly are not even high win rate cards because they have a win rate of like 56 or 55. While there are a bunch of black cards that have win rate of 58 that are having alpha of 6. So they go like 4 picks later than the white cards. If you look white cards also never go super late in the draft. Like the white card that goes the latest is around 6.2 of the ALSA. Two black cards hanging around pick 5. I do not know by heart, but I can check it in some seconds. Oh, I could if my Excel didn't decide that it wants to die. Just give me a second. I know I can check it. Black cards around ALSA 5. It will be, stop moving. Extract a confession and unscrupulous agent. These are the two cards that we're talking about here. These are these two. And the one just above 6 is going to be Snarling Gorehound. Yeah. So that I assume is murder and murder and what? It's going to be murder and should be only murder. I can't find it. Slice from the shadows, with Slice having a lower win rate, obviously. I don't know, obviously, yeah. Okay, but you can see that the white card that goes the latest has also only like 6.2, and there's a whole cluster of cards in other colors that have ALSA that is way lower and still have higher win rates than that last pick of, well, that least picked white card. So from what I can see in this graph is that white is going to be a tough ask to draft against the bots, because bots pick white disproportionately. Green has a cluster of really strong cards that go later by 1, 2 picks, maybe even 3 picks, that still have a decent win rate. There are some green cards that are really good that go quite late as well. So green is one abusable strategy in this draft format. There is a bunch of good to decent blue cards that you can always pick, and there is several black cards that go late. So I would say multicolors are the more abusable strategy. Now, I could do the same graph for uncommons. I didn't, but I could. And then figure out if there are some uncommons that go particularly late. Maybe there are some build-around cards that I can sort of hope on getting repeatedly against the bots. And you can look at those kind of things relatively easy and try to abuse the bots. And it's worth doing it. If you're playing with the bots, you should be doing that. You should check that. It's unfortunately leading to sort of like samey situations, but I also do know that bots do have some amount of flexibility. One thing that they will definitely do is they're going to rare draft, and there's no escaping in that. You will never get like 6 rares in a draft unless you open double rare packs in this particular format. But rares don't go late unless they are like Mole God's Revenge, Rampage, or whatever it is. So some strategies are never available in bot draft almost per definition, like 5-color soupy decks, because these ones want to have those rares that no one is interested in and that go late in the third pack because people opened them and they were not in the right colors. Unfortunately, this strategy that will not happen because WotC on purpose made the bots rare draft because they don't want to give away rares through the bots drafting. If you want to rare draft, it's actually better to pay extra and play a human draft, because humans pass the rares much more reliably than bots do. So yeah, that's how you can abuse the bots. Oops. I'm going to hide the question from Nerdy Steve. Okay, are there systematic differences between Premier and traditional draft aside from typical sideboard cards, maybe on an archetype level? That's the question from Leviathan Magic Organizer. which I checked. It's a Twitter account that is running some sort of software to organize your card collection that is compatible with Mac. So if you're looking for something like that, maybe it's worth to give it maybe it's good to give it a look. No one paid me for that. I don't think that Leviathan Magic Organizer is in the position to pay someone for advertisement, so I'm giving it for free. That's the kind of a person I am. Being a mostly best-of-3 player, I would love to hear if there are any significant differences between it and best-of-1, especially regarding speed, from Andrea Ventocattini. Two questions that are very similar, and me not being in the right window. But main differences are on the metagame level. And biggest difference that's been consistent across formats is that best-of-3 draft is much more competitive in terms of pods. Especially since the price level adjustments for best-of-3, there's been a very big difference in the win rate based on this change when they introduced play-in points as a reward, and you don't win 3,000 gold, 3,000 gems for free owing anymore. Lots of people stopped playing best-of-3 for that, and I think it became much more sweaty, and the win rates of 17 lens users plummeted in that draft because I think that lots of those low win rate players stopped playing best-of-3. I think for the right reasons, they shouldn't be playing best-of-3 when you're not a high win rate player, basically ever. I think in arena, unless you're like you don't care about gems. But best-of-3 queues are good 2 weeks ahead of the curve, which means that those good cards that are maybe slightly undervalued in best-of-1, they stop being undervalued in best-of-3 very quickly, like 2 weeks quicker than they do in best-of-1. So pods are tougher, and that has some knock-on effects on how decks look like. So, for example, best-of-1 amplifies the win rate of bombs because if you're playing against someone who has a bomb, even good players will sometimes not play around the bomb card because you can't play around everything, and you just hope that they don't have the mythic that would completely wreck you, but sometimes they do. In best-of-3, the good part is that if they wrecked you with a bomb in games 2 and hopefully game 3, you will play around this card because you know it exists, and that lowers the power of those bombs, because if you can deploy a plan that neutralizes that bomb, great. In best-of-1, that will never happen. Because the pods are so competitive in best-of-3, it makes weaker colors more playable. So I checked the differences in win rate between best-of-1 and best-of-3, and the cards that have that gain most power in best-of-3 are the cards from the underplayed color, like green cards, black cards. These are proportionally slightly more powerful in best-of-3 than best-of-1, because in best-of-1 you're more likely that you're going to get this busted white-red deck, and weaker archetypes can't do anything against a busted white-red deck, but they have a chance against a mediocre white-red deck. And in competitive pods in best-of-3, you don't have such a big chance of drafting a busted white-red deck. You'll probably end up somewhere between good to mediocre range. This gives chance to slower decks in this format to actually win. Best-of-3 also has less rare drafting. And I know it's because more people are more sweaty in the best-of-3 queues, or because even in pack 3 you still need to think about the deck because you are not guaranteed to have the right level of playables. So instead of picking something for 20 gems, you're going to maybe pick something that is fringe playable for your deck. Also, you're picking a broader pool of cards because you're not only selecting cards for your deck, you're also picking cards for your sideboard. And because of that, some picks are locked because, in best-of-1, you have your 23 playables, maybe 2 lands, whatever. The rest you don't care about because you will never change it. Let's be honest. We rarely adjust our decks in between rounds. In best-of-3, you're picking also maybe 5 to 6 cards that you want to have as flexible slots in your sideboard. So rare drafting will happen less. So advice, if you want to rare draft, you go to best of three queues, and you definitely don't go to the quick draft queues. And best of three cards that are drafted higher than in best of one. So if their alpha is lower than in best alpha and best of one, are who is who of underrated good cards. And if I go to my trusty Excel, then I can read you some of the cards that are the biggest difference in alpha between best of three and best of one. Let's look at it. Greystone Strider is picked much higher in best of three than in best of one. Killer Among Us, Repulsive Mutation, Hard Evidence, Loxodon's Eavesdropper, Sanitation Automaton, Escape Tunnel, Evidence Examiner, Vitugazi Inspector, Get a Leg Up, Nervous Gardener, Crozen Tusker, Coerced to Kill, Doppelgang, Glint Weaver, Projector Inspector. These are all Nyx Weaver, Chalk Outline. These are all the cards that are picked higher in best of three. But we also have Dog Walker. We also have On the Job. We also have Enlisted Worm, Flourishing Bloomkin. Those kind of cards are picked higher. The cards that are picked lower in best of three, we have Ixidor, Reality Sculptor. Do you even know what it does? Barbed Servitor. Do you even know what it does? Case of the Pilfer Proof, Treacherous Greed, Kylox, Assassin's Trophy, Doorkeeper Thrall, Mistway Spy, Faith Flight. So cards that are not that great, but are picked slightly higher, mainly because they are rare in the best of one queues. Okay. And that brings us to the end of the episode, when I hopefully managed to answer 23 really questions, because one was not answered and is going to be moved to the next episode that I'm doing solo, and try to answer that to Pip the Goblin, who was also, I was a guest at Pip the Goblin's show. Pip the Goblin is a goblin that will come to maybe some of the Pro Tour level tournaments as a hand puppet, doing interviews with people and giving away stuff. So if you're going to those, check that out. But I would like to thank 17 Lands team, because all those questions that you had, apart from the cat ones, in which 17 Lands can't help me really, I have to do it on my own. The rest of them have been only possible because 17 Lands not only collects the data, but also releases it to anyone, and anyone can analyze it. So let's love it. I especially would like to give a lot of love to Ale Ballini, because Ale is doing so much behind the scene for 17 Lands nowadays, and is relatively unknown because doesn't get the spotlight. I'm hogging all the spotlight, and Ale is doing all the work. So please give some love to Ale, as it's insane what the amount of extra work he's doing behind the scenes to make sure that new set is going to come out smoothly. And I'm pretty sure that he just went to sleep recently after trying to fix some small things with the 17 Lands. I would also like to thank mtgazone.com for the sponsorship. I would like to thank my patrons, including the 3 new ones in Joel, Maxim, and Zimon. And I would like to thank Fake Jake Brown, who is my secret helper elf, so secret that his name appears in literally every acknowledgement I do. And I would like to thank Asesco and Mana Junkie for the music I used in the podcast version of it. And with that, I won't see you next week, but I will see you on the Monday of the 8th, when we are going to do our draft skeleton stream. So I'll see you then. And till then, I'm going to be on a holiday. Yay! See you next time.